Inclusion Solution Live, the Winters Group's podcast for all things diversity, equity, and inclusion. I am your host, Brittany J. Harris, Vice President of Learning and Innovation, and I am excited to leverage this medium as yet another opportunity to facilitate dialogue, shift perspectives, and empower action in service of equity, justice, and inclusion. This season, we are demystifying internalized oppression. Today, for this episode, I am joined by none other than Mary Frances Winters, our leader, the epitome, if you ask me, of Black woman magic, a thought leader in the DEI space, recently recognized in Forbes, author of 5 books, about to be 6, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. A trailblazer, having been honored by the Forum on Workplace Inclusion, Profiles in Diversity, Chamber of Commerce, and many, many more. The boss, my boss, so y'all can only imagine how much pressure I'm feeling right now. The president and founder of the Winters Group, Mary Frances Winters. I think we should edit in some drum roll or something here. Mary Frances, super excited to have you on the Inclusion Solution Live.
Well, thank you for that. I think we should have a drum roll or something for that introduction. That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Brittany.
I told the folks on our intro episode that this has been a long time coming, and so we're just really excited that the Inclusion Solution Live is now an extension of how we continue to engage in, facilitate, and bring bold, inclusive conversations to the world. To get us kicked off, I know I gave my introduction, my perspective, short bio on Mary Frances, but if you could just share a little bit more about yourself, those aspects of your identity that influence who you are and how you show up in and beyond this work. We'll get started there and then jump into our conversation.
Thanks so much, Brittany. Yes, this has been a long time coming, and I'm glad that we are doing this and offering this topic as our first topic. I have been doing this work now for a long time. It seems like all of my life, actually, since I was 5 years old, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But as the Winters Group CEO for almost 36 years now, that I have been doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And it really identifies who I am, because as a Black woman, we talk about our I ams and our identity. And of course, they are totally intersectional, and there are many identities that I claim. But for this podcast, I really want to focus on my Blackness, my womanness, and my generation as a baby boomer, because I think that those are the three that right now for me are manifesting and showing up most. As a Black person, it's been since I was 5 years old, because I didn't know I was Black until I was 5. And somebody called me the N-word in kindergarten. And that's when I realized that, oh, I'm different than everybody else. So maybe I was clueless at 5, but anyway, I just thought we were just all the same, right? So since I was 5 years old, I've known that people might be mean to you or might treat you differently because of what you look like. So those are the identities that I bring. And my passion for this work is because as I get older and I see folks coming into the workplace, and I have conversations with people who find me on LinkedIn, younger people who want to just talk about their experiences. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you're having the same experience that I had 30 years ago. And so I just have to be about this work to support the ideas that, in fact, the world is different for us. The world is different for Black people. The world is different for women. The world is different for people who come from different gender identities. And there's a lot right now around denying that. And so it's really important for me to bring voice and help people bring their voices to the concerns and issues.
Mm-hmm. And so thank you for sharing that, Mary Frances. For your post in particular, and for the folks who have not read it, Mary Frances entitled it "The Pain of Internalized Oppression," and specifically focused on race and color. So some of those messages that you've internalized around race and color. What was this exercise like, or this reflection like for you, Mary Frances? And I'm particularly interested in why you use the qualifier or term pain to describe your reflection.
Yeah, because it hurts. A lot of times it hurts to not be accepted or not knowing if you're
Mm,
going to be accepted. It hurts when you feel like you have to get angry or call somebody out because you're in a store and somebody doesn't recognize you or takes the person who was behind you before. I mean, just the little, just living while Black can be really painful. And part of the pain comes from, am I being too sensitive? Well, what was that just about?
mm,
Did that have something to do with me being Black, or was that just like, just forget it? And so it's even painful to have to go through that kind of mental exercise, that kind of self-talk, to understand, what might be going on. So that's why I say that it's painful. And I think also for children, I'm thinking back to my experience when I was 5 years old, what we see happening with our children in schools, where there's so much bias around brown and Black kids who don't get the acknowledgement or the recognition for their intelligence, or the assumption is that they don't have intelligence or that their parents don't care. And my daughter-in-law does research on this, and she's done some research with kids, and they say they know. I mean, they know when
mhm.
their teacher is treating them differently. They know when they're getting an assumption that they're not listening, or that they don't care, or that they're not smart enough. And so it hurts, and it is very painful.
It's so, and so since you bring that up, there was this essay that I read by James Bowen a couple months ago, and it was like a talk to teachers. And in it, he was, same thing you're saying, was talking about how children learn more about the system. And so perhaps they're not calling it racism and inequity or like, oppression, but learn just by experiencing, right? And so he talked about a child who experiences a white neighborhood versus their own. And he talked about a Black child, their Black neighborhood, which is um, perhaps of a lower socioeconomic background, and how just by that child experiencing a neighborhood that is perceivably a majority white being better and nicer and better schools and cleaner, and experiencing theirs, which is very different, they're internalizing, they're learning these systems without even necessarily, maybe naming it as a system, but learning it and internalizing it. And it's
Exactly.
becoming a part of who they are. And like part of the work is supporting them and like unpacking that. And so it's interesting to hear you say you realized this at 5, because there are some people, we've done labs where some people, and predominantly white people, say I never even had to think about race, or there's even broader like social messages or norms now that would say, oh, kids don't see color. How many times have I been in a session where I wish everyone could be like our kids and not see or understand color? And I'm like, I don't know if that's the
Oh,
case.
well, and we know from research that they do. So
Right.
people who are familiar with the Black doll experiment
Mm-hmm.
know that
Mm-hmm.
kids absolutely see the white
Yes.
dolls over and over again. If I'm not
Right.
going to go into it here, but if you don't know about it, Kenneth Clark, back in the 40s, a psychologist, a Black psychologist, and his wife did this experiment where they showed the kids Black dolls and white dolls, and every single time almost, the Black kids, these are preschool kids, said that the white dolls were
Mm-hmm.
better than, prettier than, smarter than the Black ones. And then
Mm-hmm.
somebody repeated the same experiment back,
Mm-hmm.
like more recently, with the same result.
Mm-hmm. And there were Black children who, and this is such a good
Exa-
example of internalized oppression, like a Black children who
exactly.
preferred like the
Exactly.
white dolls.
These were all Black
Um,
children who preferred. Yes.
mm-hmm. And so that kind of gets me to my second question. So for the folks who haven't read the post, or maybe for the folks who read it some time ago, could you just talk a little bit more about some of the experiences you shared, or perhaps others that have influenced some of the harmful messages or biases you learned and internalized around race and color?
Yeah, so I grew up in a household where, I realize now that my mother was really, prejudiced against Black folks. She's Black, but she would say to me things like, at your age, not your color,
Mm,
which was this message that my color was something, negative or bad. Um, I had, colorism was something because I was lighter skinned than, and I was, called high yellow, and girls wanted to fight me because I thought I was, cuter than them. I didn't even like what, I didn't even know what they were talking about. And so, from a very early age, the idea of color, the idea that there are difference, this whole idea, if you're white, stick around. If you're brown, you're all right. If you're black, get back. Type of, and
Mm,
was even a song about that. So within our own race, the internalized oppression and around feeling that even though lighter skin was supposed to be better, that's not how I felt it. I felt it as being something that was excluding me from being a total part of. And as a child, it's just very hard to comprehend. You don't have the skills and the education and the developed brain to be able to do anything else but to feel the pain, and that's why I called it
mm-hmm,
the pain.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so, in what ways, have you, we talk about in this work like reflection, think really of ourselves being a journey. And so, when you think about um, all that you've learned and how you've continuously like reflected on the messages you've learned, in what ways have these or do these show up in how you understand the world today, or even in our work?
Yeah, so I think that when I do my own self reflection, and you wrote about the angry Black woman, I think that
Mm-hmm.
for me it manifests oftentimes as anger as well. I can see myself in settings where I perhaps will have an outburst, and people will look at me and like, "Oh, what's wrong with Mary Frances?" Or she's well, that was inappropriate. And so times where I can't control the pain, if you will, and so it manifests. It manifests as an outburst, as a visible kind of outburst. I think other times it helps me with my writing, and you mentioned the books we're going to talk about in a little bit, but it helps me to chronicle these experiences and what they do to the mind, the body, and the spirit. I think that in the work, I can empathize more with the different identity groups. For example, today I've been working on summarizing some focus groups that we did for a client, and in looking at how the different segments in this focus groups, we did focus groups with white men, we did focus groups with women of color, we did focus groups with white women. And was interesting in this particular one that the white men recognized their privilege. They said, yeah, well, we recognize that we have the privilege. Women of color, talked about the fact that they're seen as intimidating, and people are afraid of them. And so I can resonate with that. And so hopefully you can go back to the client and say, this is real. And that's why we work with, our bold, inclusive conversations, that the first step is to be able to talk about the reality of this and not dismiss it or denigrate it as being, something that you're making up. So I think that those are some of the kinds of ways that I deal with it. I try to be someone who, is a listening ear for those. I get a lot of requests sort of just randomly from on LinkedIn and whatnot. I know who you are. Would you just be willing to talk with me? And I'll do that sometimes. I don't even tell you about that, Brittany. I don't even tell Marisha. Sometimes I'll just do that. I'll just reach out and say, yeah, give me a call. And these are women of color, Black women who just want to talk, who just want to say
Mm-hmm.
that, so that's why it's painful. It's
Mm-hmm.
painful. So I think those are the ways to deal. But you mentioned earlier systems, and I think, we can tell our stories, our individual stories, but until we get to the systemic aspects of
Mm-hmm.
this, which we haven't been able to do in 400 years and 50 years, or whatever marker you want to put at the time frame that you start, we haven't dealt with the systems, and that's what we have to
Mm-hmm.
undo. And that's all related to power. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so I think that for the time being, we're putting band-aids on it. We're trying to help people um, through things like self-care and things like taking care of your own well-being, being not being hard on yourself, being intentional about recognizing that, hey, this is real for me. I did have this experience. It's not in my head. I'm not being overly sensitive, and I need somebody that I can just talk to about it so that I can continue to be whole, so that I can continue to go on and wake up tomorrow morning and not have to call in black.
Hmm. That's so, that systems part, and I can't give it away. And so, folks, I have had the opportunity to connect with everyone on the team who wrote about their narrative, and so there's so much in my head that I can't give away because I don't know when you're gonna hear from them. But in one of the other episodes, we bring up this point of systems, and you know what? Systems, they don't come out of nowhere, right? Systems of inequity or oppression don't just pop out of nowhere. They're influenced by like people. They're influenced by people who, hey, by the way, Ray Francis said it, hold power, hold privilege, perhaps have lack of awareness around the ways in which their behaviors, norms, how they see and understand their other, how that influences the policies they make or the practices they put out or what they sort of normalize. And no one's immune to that, right? And so one of the things that I actually quoted you in the intro episode, Mary Francis, the whole preaching to the choir thing, right? Preaching to the choir and how we sometimes need like, new tunes. And you mentioned in your introduction or in your childhood experience that even your mom, as a Black woman, held like prejudice and sort of narrative or message or biases, against her own group. And I think that's powerful because to some extent, that's what this episode or this series is all about. All of us do, right? All of us do. And it's really about holding ourselves accountable to thinking about it, challenging, like constantly reflecting, thinking on it, figuring out how it makes us feel, and all of that. One of the things that comes up for me when I think about internalized oppression, specifically as it relates to Blackness and the Black experience, is this whole notion of like respectability politics, right? And so, um, for the folks on or the folks who are listening, we like to define as we go. And so, if you aren't familiar with the term, respectability politics, typically used in equity, social justice spaces, but it's this notion that if, Black people, people of color, but specifically Black people, govern themselves a certain way. And so a certain way that appeal to the dominant group, be it in their names, how they speak, how they dress, how they wear their hair, then they'd be more deserving of access or better or fair treatment. It can kind of be likened to this notion of like assimilation. Well, you would get ahead if only you did this. And one could say that respectability politics, sure, while it's used, broadly, as a way to minimize or use broadly by dominant people who are in dominant groups, it's also internalized. Those very same messages around assimilation and respectability politics are internalized by the people or by groups that it seeks to oppress, Black people. And so down to how we see what is professional or how we see who is desirable or worthy. And so, Mary Frances, I wanted to just get your thoughts on the term and the workaround, respectability politics, and specifically the role of DI practitioners in really challenging, right? Challenging ourselves, holding ourselves accountable to not perpetuating these fairly like subtle covert dynamics.
Yeah, so I know that the term is not necessarily new. It's been being used for some time. So I would question, who's defining respectability? And we know who's defining respectability.
Mm-hmm.
The dominant group, the dominant narrative defines respectability. So early in my career, I was wearing a short afro, but this is back in the late 70s. I've always pretty much worn my hair natural. One of my colleagues, wasn't even my boss, one of my colleagues came into my office one day and said, "Will your hair grow?" And I was like, "Yeah." He says, "Well, you ought to let it." In other words, your hairstyle is not respectable. It doesn't fit,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't fit the norm. So how do you think I went home that night? I didn't change my hairstyle, but it was painful. So I think that these kinds of terms like respectability politics, I think that I don't subscribe to them. I think it's just another way of keeping those who have already been oppressed and marginalized, because again, in my corporate experience, and even now as a, as the owner of a company, I think about where I'm going to go and what I'm looking like and how it's going to be perceived. And so I wear my hair now in a style called sister locks. And I never wear the sister locks straight so that they just look like quote, dreadlocks. I curl them so that they look more, quote, respectable. And I think about that. Oh, I got to wash my hair. Oh, I got to curl my hair because I've got to go such and such a place. I had on some pale blue nail polish one time, and I got feedback from the client that, Mary Frances came in blue nail polish, and that's not professional. you know, to be honest with you, it was my first time. I just drifted away. Baby boomer, so I'm into the pinks and the reds. But I drifted away this one time. I said, oh, they're wearing all kind of colors these days. Let me wear blue. And I got called for wearing blue. So who's determining and how? So for me, let me just flip the script here. For me, respectability politics is for us as a people. I'm going to talk about Black people right now. That we find that self-respect, however and whatever that looks like for us. So respectability politics is for me respecting myself and developing norms for me that fit my values, that fit my religious beliefs, and it may not fit what somebody else believes. I don't like saggy pants. I don't like Black boys wearing saggy pants. I don't like that. But that's me. I don't like it. Okay. But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to respect a young Black man that I might encounter who has saggy pants. Right? So I cannot like it, but it doesn't mean that I don't respect. So I think respect. So I do like respectability politics if you define it in my way.
Taking it back, that is. I think it is so real to say. You know what? There are things, and you say it often in our work, that we accept but don't necessarily have to agree, right? And it's agree with. And inequity happens when we start to ascribe value to, because I don't like it, or because it's not my norm, because I don't think it is quote unquote professional. I'm now gonna ascribe value to it, that it is the other, right? And then that turns into, again, like systems. um what are your thoughts on the role of DEI practitioners in pushing back on assimilation? So I'll give you some context. I was watching, and maybe this ties into the generational piece too. I don't know, but I was watching a live where Black millennial woman, she was talking about a mentor of hers, who she hadn't seen in years. And so I guess prior to her reconnecting with the mentor, she was wearing, she had permed or straight hair. And so when she reconnected with the mentor, she had kind of decided to go natural, had her curly fro. She was sharing that she was going on an interview. And the woman, who was also a Black woman but older, said, well, make sure you do something with that hair of yours. And she shared on her life like how taken aback she was by that, because this is someone who's an advocate and someone who she considers a mentor and someone who, and her response to her mentor was, well, I don't know if I want to work there if they won't accept me for my hair. And so I wonder, just your perspective, that's a kind of individual level experience that I'm sure isn't one off, right? But your perspective on what or how advocates, change agents, people who are doing this work, like how they can, what their role is rather in challenging and holding ourselves accountable. It's not perpetuating, right? Assimilation or expectations around assimilation in the work that we're doing, or even how we're bringing others along.
Yeah, so I think that many people in this work feel forced to conform to the systems, feel forced to uphold the very systems that we're trying to dismantle. They are oftentimes find themselves in what's the phrase, a rock and a hard place, because they need their job, their livelihood. They have attained that role because of their, knowledge, expertise, and, the chief diversity officer now. By the same token, they go to the CEO, and in discussion with the CEO says, this is what I want. This is what works here. And so the chief diversity officer can say, yes, but it doesn't work for everybody. And so this is where you get into this sort of how much do we assimilate and how much do we really want to change the systems? So to be a little bit radical, the only way that systems have been dismantled in our world ever is through bloodshed. And I'm not suggesting bloodshed. Look at what's going on in Hong Kong right now, where they're trying to dismantle a system. Look at through our history. And so systems do not get dismantled without some kind of protest, some kind of struggle, some kind of fight. And so in organizations that are nicely self-contained and you've got your hallowed halls and all of those kinds of things, and we're in those hallowed halls a lot with the marble and you're walking through, they're insulated in some ways, and their structures are just so entrenched that I feel that it is almost impossible unless something happens. And that's why change in organizations has oftentimes happened as a result of a class action lawsuit or employees walking out and protesting. I know, I was still in, not that bad, I was still in school back then, but in high school, but in the 60s, worked the corporations with the riots and whatnot. And my first corporation that I worked for was Eastman Kodak Company in Rochester, New York. They had all sorts of riots. They had all sorts of things happening that made Eastman Kodak Company then say that they were going to take affirmative action and start to hire people of color. And I benefited from that, actually, as a hire. As a matter of fact, they begged me to come work for them. I went with a friend. She was going to apply for a summer job. I already had a summer job. The interviewer just kept coming over to me. Don't you want a summer job too? Don't you want? I said, no, I'm going to go home for this summer. But they begged me to come and work for them because they were under this pressure. So systems that work for dominant groups, why do they have an incentive to change those systems? I'm just being real right now. We talk about power and privilege. What's the incentive to share that power? What's the incentive to recognize that privilege and want to give up that privilege? What's the real incentive to do so?
So, and again, without giving it away, it's we will, y'all, and this is kind of a teaser as we get to the end of our conversation, as we get to the end of the episode, really unpack how when Travis Jones is going to unpack how whiteness and power can be to the detriment of those who experience it. That's just a teaser for y'all to stay on. But Mary Frances, that is so so true. We're coming up on the end, and there are a few questions that I want to get in. One, this was obviously a reflective exercise for you and the team who engaged in it. Certainly has been eye-opening for me. Why, from your perspective, is this depth of reflection, critical thinking, really interrogating oneself so important to you and the work that we do? Because, we hear all the time, it's like, oh, let me get to the action, tell us what to do. Like, why is this part of, demystifying internalized oppression, unpacking our ideals and identity? Why is this so important?
So recognizing my internalized oppression helps me to recognize what some of my insecurities are, or may be going into, situations. Am I good enough? The imposter syndrome that sometimes, comes up for me. I'm like, where did that come from? But it comes up, and so I have to deal with it. And so it's like talking to myself. We're going to talk about my next book, Inclusive Conversations. And one of the chapters in that book is first talk to yourself and learn how to have these conversations with yourself to work through them. And psychologists say talking out loud to yourself is really important when you're trying to do that. So I think that you come to situations much stronger when you've done that self work, when you've done that self talk. And I think that perhaps dominant group folks don't do that enough because they're in the dominant group. What do they have to think about? There's not a trigger for them. There's not a trigger oftentimes that would make them go to this deeper level of interrogation. So unless they're willing to be an ally and learn how to be an ally, unless they're willing to take this seriously, unless they're willing to take collective responsibility, which I also talk about, in the new book, unless they're willing to do that, they might not be, the spark might not come for them to go deeper.
We talked about in another series on the inclusion solution how much of a veil sort of being part of dominant groups and power can be in this work. And I would offer, just for the listener, I know we have are going to have a diverse range of listeners, but thinking about how your different dominant group identities, right, can influence not only the messages, norms that you that perhaps come out in the interpersonal, right, but the intrapersonal. And so one of the things I read, I'm not going to stay here long, but it just came to me about the respectability politics things, was that a lot of times it was more so perpetuated by sort of the Black elite, right? And so Black people who sure experienced racial oppression, racism, but hey, also experienced sort of socioeconomic status, right? Like there's articles out there that'll unpack respectability politics and like internalized oppression in sort of like the modern day Black elite, one of which was like Bill Cosby, but we won't even go down
Yeah,
there.
I read. Yeah, I
Anyway.
read it. I read it. I read it. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyways, but you did. I want to make sure we have time to talk a little bit more, especially since you
Well, let me
talked
just
about.
let me just say something about that with the
Okay.
respectability politics. And so the Black elite. So sometimes it's like, look, this is what I had to do to make it. So if you want to make it, this is what you got to do too. Yeah, I couldn't wear my pants hanging down. I couldn't wear natural hair. I had to do this. I had to do this. I had to do this because, in essence, I had to assimilate is what they're basically saying. And so 35 years ago, I decided that I'm not going to assimilate. I'm going to leave the corporate world and I'm going to, be able to have my own voice. Now, I'm not denigrating anybody who's chosen to, because we need people inside of
Yes.
organizations as well.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. All I'm saying is that we have to recognize that when the folks are inside an organization, they are sometimes limited in what they can, and the change that they can really
Mm-hmm.
make, because you
Mm-hmm.
got to be with them. They've got to accept you first before they'll allow your voice to be heard.
Mm-hmm.
And how do I get accepted? And many times the only way that somebody of color can get accepted is if they think, oh, you're just like me. You're not like one of them. You're more like me.
Mm-hmm. That's so. I was just reading this study that unpacked the success of, or like uh uh took a look at the excess of Black leaders in obviously predominantly white institutions or corporations. And um, there were two factors that they associated with effectiveness. And one was effectiveness specifically around like equity and inclusion and obviously business success. And one was sort of like out group, the extent to which the out group, and so in this case, white people like saw themselves in that leader, right? And so their proximity to them,
Mm-hmm.
and that leader's level of self understanding, self pride, self awareness, sort of like really being grounded, right? And I thought it was such a compelling study because it held space for like the both and, right? Because I think a lot of times we think that we can't go in spaces and be ourselves or be authentic and be successful. And this study was essentially saying that, and kind of like what you were getting at with like kind of taking back the respectable, like authenticity looks a certain way to me, and hey, I can be authentic without necessarily being oppressive or colluding. You know what I mean? Or I
Mm-hmm.
can figure out ways to, we say it in our work all the time, adapt versus, kind of like just assimilate for survival, which is so different. And I get it. That's a whole nother like episode. But that's what came up for me. Um,
And I know we
Mary
have to
Frank,
go, but one more thing. And it
yeah,
shows up. It shows up in Black leaders such as, and I'm going to call his name out, but such as Black leaders like Ben Carson.
he's
Right?
one like they called him out in the study, Mary Francis.
Oh,
He's
they
one of the
did.
ones they call him like
Okay.
a co-opted. It's like I gotta send it to you.
Right. Okay.
Once
Well,
you
that's
said it, he
okay.
was like on the low. He was like on the low self ID, high like out group. Yeah, it was really interesting.
Right.
It's so funny you said that. Yeah, he's in there. Um, Folks, what we'll probably do is just include a link, just so we're at least giving you context, so more context than what we're talking about. A link to the book. Speaking of books, Mary Frances has two coming out, and so if you wouldn't mind, Mary Frances, sharing with the folks on who are listening a little bit more about what you're writing, and even like connecting it back to what we've shared so far around this self work, pain, identity. Oh, that good stuff.
Absolutely. So somebody might say, well, why does she have two books coming out? Because I was only going to have one book come out, but the publisher said, wow, there's just too much in here, and it's two books. Okay. So one book is called Inclusive Conversations, Fostering Equity, Empathy, and Belonging Across Difference. And the points that I make in that book, because we still are not having inclusive conversations. We call them at the Winners Group bold inclusive conversations. And I lay out some conditions that are necessary to have the conversations. Everybody wants me to write a book that says, give me the 5 steps for inclusive conversations. I can't give you the 5 steps because it's more complex than that. And this gets at the systems. Unless we dig deeper into the systems that are precluding the inclusive conversations, I can give you 5 steps, but it's just a Band-Aid, and that wound is not going to heal. And when you take that Band-Aid off, you're going to scratch it again, and we're going to be right back to where we are. So in that book, what I try to do is I try to go a lot deeper about what some of these conditions are. And one of the conditions is, I'm just going to go into one, is that inclusive conversations have to be equitable conversations. So you've got to have a sense of you have to establish a sense of equity in the conversation. You're going to be talking, let's say there's a Black woman who wants to talk about her career or lack of career upward mobility with her boss, and her boss is a white male. So he has power because he has positional power because he is her boss. But he also has perhaps identity power as well as a white male in a white male dominated organization. So in order to have that conversation, what I'm saying is that he has to acknowledge that first. He has to first acknowledge, I am in a power position here, and let's talk about how those power dynamics are going to play out in this conversation. So let's not just jump into the conversation and assume that we have equity, assume that this Black woman can come to the table and talk to this boss about why hasn't she been promoted. And then I talk about the self-work, the self-reflection that needs to be done. Why hasn't she been promoted? Gee, who are the last 5 people that I promoted? Et cetera, et cetera. So that's just a glimpse at what that book is about. And it is practical as well. So I do give examples of what the conversations might look like. I give examples of what the conditions have to be and how you talk about those conditions, before the conversation happens. Are these conditions present? And then you get into the conversations. So that book will come out July. And the next book, which I'm really excited about, and the publisher is really excited about too, is called Black Fatigue. I have been hearing so much from people in the settings that I'm in, particularly Black people, particularly Black millennials. We're exhausted. We're exhausted with this struggle. We're exhausted having to teach white people what it's like to not have equity, to not be treated equitably in organizations. And I was like, wow, millennials are tired,
That used to be a thing, y'all.
I know. I would joke about it. I don't joke
I'm
about
like,
it
yeah,
anymore. I don't joke about it anymore. I used to say, y'all are too young to be tired. You're 25 years old. They didn't appreciate that. So I don't say that anymore, right? So I acknowledge and respect that, hey, no matter how old you are, it's tiring. That's part of the pain because, pain and exhaustion. I mean, all those things are connected. And so whenever I said to anybody, I'm thinking about writing this book called Black Fatigue, everybody would say, oh, you got to write it. Oh, it's so important. And so how does Black fatigue play out in our criminal justice system? How does it play out in our educational systems? How does it play out in our workplaces? How does it play out in all of the socioeconomic spheres that we are in housing and, and all of these things. So this book is going to explore why it's just really tiring, about the Black tax. And we pay more, we struggle more just to live every single day, just to live our lives every single day. And guess what? It makes us sicker, physically sicker. This is why we have higher incidences of diabetes and and infant mortality rates are higher, even for middle-class Black women who are in professional roles. So I think that it's important. And we all know, Black people all know that there's Black fatigue. There was a concern that white people might not read the book because it's entitled Black Fatigue, How Racism Erodes the Mind, Body, and Spirit. But I'm going to make sure that folks know that this book is not just for Black people. Because there are solutions. And the solutions, Brittany, are going to be at the systems level. What do we need to do at the systems level to dismantle? And some of it is going to be that those who have the power have to be willing to, we're not seeing that in our politics today. So when we see things like a whole political party staying together just because they're a part of that political party and not based on morals and values, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if we can even make progress if that's the case, if we stay connected just because we're a part of that in group. And we won't break away when we see things that are inequitable. I don't know. But that's what I'm going to recommend, that we have to be able, and I'm going to look at the connections to the systems, how housing is connected to the workplace and is connected to all of these other kinds of aspects, and how the systems are set up to disadvantage Black people in particular. And this book is about Black fatigue. It's not about multicultural, because I think oftentimes in our diversity, equity, inclusion space, when you start to talk about Blackness by itself, you get pushback because, well, what about this group or what about that group? And I apologize in the preface by saying I am sure that other groups probably are experiencing pain and exhaustion and fatigue as well. And you may be able to get something, from this book from that. But I really just want to focus on how it manifests for Black people, because I think that there are nuances and idiosyncrasies that are unique to us.
Mm-hmm. Huge, 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 huge. We are excited. I was excited, y'all, when Mary Frances shared that she'd be writing on Black fatigue. And I think it is so powerful just to call out, like even in your intro, to just say, like, this is I'm centering this discussion, this dialogue on my Blackness, the Black experience, and to do so and be comfortable doing so, even unapologetically. There was a study a couple weeks ago that came out, Center of Talent Innovation, that talked about being Black in corporate America. And one of the things that the study found was many of the gaps, right, around diversity, equity, or what was sort of the stagnant or lack thereof of progress is around disparities that exist between Black people and white people. And so, like, that gap is even greater. And they offered in the recommendations, hey, a focus more on or a stride towards equity or more racially just workplace would be honoring, focusing, developing systems that center Blackness, that get to these unique experiences. One of which is going to be, one of which is definitely Black fatigue, especially with all this stuff around just like race and identity trauma, and oh, it's so connected. And you said it. It's so connected. This has been a wonderful conversation. Hopefully, you all have already downloaded the reflection guide. We say it over and over again. You just don't learn by listening and experiencing. You learn by reflecting on those experiences and what you heard. And so definitely would suggest that you download the reflection guide on our site. Think about Mary Frances's reflection and responses, and think through what aligns with your experience. What was perhaps new to you, challenging for you to understand, and why might that be? Think about those groups that you are part of, right? What are some of aspects of your identity where you have internalized negative messages? What experiences have contributed to that? And then, moreover, how does it show up in your day to day world? How does it show up in your work? What can you do? Think about the ways in which you can continue to challenge yourself, and hold yourself to countering those negative messages and biases, in how you're thinking and how you engage with others. But then, moreover, as Mary Frances said, in the systems and policies and practices that we put into place. That is all we had for you today. Mary Frances, any parting thoughts you want to share with folks before we sign off?
I just want to thank the listeners for tuning in and hearing what we have to say. And I hope that it will spark something in you to take some action that is in support of dismantling racist and inequitable systems.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Folks, as usual, we end our sessions and, of course, our podcast, the Inclusion Solution Live, with our commitment to live inclusively. I'm going to read it, I'm going to ask that you listen and then take this with you as you go on. I commit to be intentional and living inclusively. I commit to spending more time getting to know myself and understanding my culture. It is in understanding myself that I am better positioned to understand others. I will acknowledge that I don't know what I don't know, but I will not use what is unconscious as an excuse. I will be intentional in exposing myself to difference. If I don't know, I'll ask. If I am asked, I will assume positive intent. Most importantly, I will accept my responsibility in increasing my own knowledge and understanding. I commit to speaking up and speaking out, even when I am not directly impacted, for there is no such thing as neutrality in the quest for equity, justice, and inclusion. I will strive to accept and not just tolerate respect, even if I don't agree, and be curious, not judgmental. I commit to pausing and listening. I will be empathetic to the experiences and perspectives of my others. I will use my privilege positively and get comfortable with my own discomfort. I commit to knowing, getting, and doing better than I did yesterday, keeping in mind my commitment to live inclusively is a journey, not a destination. Until next time, folks.